Thanks so much for being here today. And I've really enjoyed every moment of this conference so far. I can't say that about every conference that I've attended, but this one has been really fantastic. I've taken the liberty of changing the title of my own talk. The other title was a bit grand. So I've called it Why Trust the Experts. And most of you, okay, so actually it's not advancing. Here. Yes. Most of you I don't know and haven't met before, at least before yesterday. So I originally trained in science and astrophysics and did some philosophy of science. And now my research focuses on 3 areas, all applied. I work on applied issues in medicine, in science, and global justice. I've just in July published a book written primarily for medical trainees called Diagnosis. So yes, it's about diagnosis. I talk about the ethics, evidence, and epistemology of medical diagnosis. And the motivation behind this book was there was a gap that I discovered actually by surprise. There was a lot of philosophy of medicine written on treatments and their evaluations. And I thought I should read about what came before that in the philosophy of medicine, the philosophy of diagnosis. And I wasn't able to find that. So I sort of spent 8 years thinking, reading, writing, thinking, and teaching on it, and then putting together this book. I also have published in philosophy of science, especially models and idealizations, but other things as well, such as mechanistic reasoning and informed consent and bioethics. And I have an ongoing project in global justice. I just yesterday actually finalized a contract for another book on child labor. And I have extensive field research experience in the country of Myanmar, working there with the International Labor Organization, also USAID and the US Department of Labor. We're currently not in country now, as some of you know. Myanmar, there was a military coup in February, so no one can get in or out now. But my interest in child labor began there, and I'm working on a larger project now. So the reason I'm saying any and all of this is I'm always looking for collaborations. And I think here, many of you are interested in philosophy of medicine, many of you are interested in philosophy of science, and many of you are interested in global justice. And I happen to be interested in all 3. So let's talk later if you're interested in a collaborative project. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I'm also interested in local justice. More recently, just actually since the beginning of the pandemic, roughly, I work as a volunteer guardian ad litem. I'm not sure if they have that here in the UK or what you call it, but I'm a trained volunteer, and I advocate for abused, abandoned, neglected children in the justice system who have no one to represent them in court. So I do that as well. So what am I supposed to talk to you about today? I'm interested in this question, the one in bold: what role does scientific expertise play in public policy? So I wrote it here, what role does it play? But really I'm interested in what role does it play and what role should it play? But in order to answer that sort of overarching bold question, we need to look at some sub-questions, so to speak. The first one, what or who is an expert? So I'll have a go at giving you a definition of an expert. You might not agree with it, and we can discuss that. And then I want to discuss the relationship between expertise and epistemic authority. I'll define that in a moment. And then the relationship between expertise and moral authority. And then ask the question, where does that leave us moving forward, especially in answering what role does and what role should scientific expertise play in public policy? Okay, so here are things that we have all heard recently. More than one talk, Steve's talk, Trish's talk yesterday, has highlighted that recently people in the public sphere, whether that's politicians, scientific experts, etc., are saying things like, trust us, trust the experts, follow the science, attacks on me or attacks on science. Anthony Fauci famously or infamously said that. And immediately, I become super worried about these things as a philosopher. So I love science. Science, in fact, was my first love. It's no longer my only love, but it still is a love. So this is not coming from someone who doesn't like science. But immediately I think, trust the experts. Like, wait, am I one of them? Or is it like those guys and I have to trust them? And who are they? And I don't know. And then when I heard this phrase, follow the science, for the first time, I literally had in my mind's eye a picture of like this dude, this, you know, buff looking hiking dude. He had a t-shirt on his head, follow me on the science. And like, he's going to take people on a hike or something. I have odd mental images sometimes, but I thought about that. And that's not what science is. It's not a hiking guide. And then attacks on me, or attacks on science, all sorts of problems with a statement like that. It sounds like I'm a scientist, so I can't be wrong, which is clearly a false statement. But I think the idea behind these kinds of statements is something like, well, there are these things, these entities, these people, scientific experts, although an expert doesn't have to be just a person, it could be, you know, an expert panel. There are these experts and they're qualified to give us accurate information and to give recommendations on how to act on that information. So I think that's the idea. And I think that idea is problematic. So I'm going to say something like, we do have reason to trust scientific experts. More in a moment on what an expert is. We can trust them to give us accurate information, but that isn't going to be enough to prescribe actions to us as the general public. Okay, but just as a disclaimer, I am going to say that there is a role for scientific expertise in public policy, and we'll try to flesh that out in a moment. So what or who is an expert? Many of you know a lot more about the literature on expertise than I do. But I think that we can all agree on this. If you've read any of it, much less all of it, the question is far from settled. Who is an expert? What is an expert? People are arguing about this. So what I did, and clearly I haven't read everything, right? But I've read some, and I picked out these three definitions. I mushed them together, spun them around a bit, and then I come up with a definition of my own. So Goldman said something like this. This is a shortened, very shortened version of his view, but he says an expert is someone who has more accurate information, that is more true beliefs than most people do in a given domain. Okay, we're going to have to add more to this, but this is pretty basic. Just more accurate information in a given domain. So there's this asymmetry between someone who's an expert and someone who's non-expert. And then a little later, Kochi comes along and says, okay, that's fine, but that's not enough. An expert also has to understand and be able to explain his or her beliefs to others. I think this is similar to, although he doesn't say this, the justified true belief account in analytic epistemology. Some of you are very familiar with that. This additional criterion of you have to be able to explain it, I think is a lot like the J, the justification criterion, in what counts as knowledge. And I am going to take this on board because from here on out, when I say expert, I'm going to mean a public expert. That is someone who talks about, professes, so to speak, their expertise in the public realm. So I think this is not, you know, necessary if you're thinking about an expert or someone sitting at home, you know, she's an expert in whatever she's an expert in and just sitting at home and doing her expert thing. When someone is in the public sphere, then we want them to be able to explain how it is that they know the things that they know to us, the non-experts. And then Bennett 2020, his recent really good paper, I recommend it. It says a lot of things, but he also says this, experts, they have to be sincere as well. So they have to know stuff, they have to be able to explain that stuff, and they have to be sincere. But not because sincerity is this nice way for people to be and we like it when they're sincere, but because otherwise they won't be reliable. I mean, we do like it and it is nice, but the reason is if they're not sincere, they won't be reliable. And if experts aren't reliable, then it's probably sort of useless to identify them as experts in the first place. So I kind of take these three together, mush them a bit, and I come up with this very rough and ready. There are holes, I won't flag them because you'll find them yourself, but rough and ready definition of a public expert is someone who's epistemically trustworthy. That just means they are competent. That is, they have more true beliefs than the non-expert, and they're capable of explaining these beliefs to others, and they're sincere. So an expert is someone who is competent and sincere. Now, I don't know if this will be sort of preaching to the choir and you're thinking, I don't need any motivation to care about who counts as an expert. But on Friday, Tuesday, a few days ago, I gave a version of this paper to some of my undergrad students at home in Florida. And some of them said something like, well, who cares if there's an expert out there and why should we care about this at all, Dr. Kennedy? And I thought, okay, so maybe I do need to motivate this a bit. We care about experts because we can learn from them. So epistemic authority is just, a bit of a fancier term. There's a relationship between expertise and epistemic authority because we, as non-experts, can learn from experts. So we should care about who the experts are if we ever have a goal of wanting to improve our own epistemic positions about anything regarding some domain or some particular set of questions within a domain. So that's what experts can do for non-experts. They can teach us things. Perhaps a boring claim, nevertheless, maybe not everyone is on board with that, so I'll mention it nonetheless. So if we have a rough and ready idea of what an expert is, then we should go out and look for them. And how do we identify them? We look for their name tags, but this is of course tongue-in-cheek because you can imagine that the very people that would wear name tags, not literal ones, but name tags, so to speak, are probably not the ones who are going to be experts, maybe. Nevertheless, we have to be able to do something. And this is a problem that's bothering me quite a lot. Actually, I don't really have a good understanding of how we identify experts. I do realize there is literature on this, and I still find it unsatisfying. So perhaps you have some ideas about this and talk about it in the Q&A. But if an expert is someone who's competent and sincere, then we need to identify competency and we need to identify sincerity. Competency, you're probably familiar with this. We look at proxies, publication records, degrees, academic appointments perhaps, but often, if not always, we are relying on experts. Other experts tell us who the other experts are, and I find this to be really unsatisfying. So if you've solved this circle that's bothering you, please let me know. So I'm just going to flag that and leave it aside, because really in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing more on the sincerity slash trustworthiness component. And I actually think, contrary to what some others are saying, that it's easier to identify that because it does, I think, all come out in the wash, so to speak. So if we look at track record, if somebody is not trustworthy, if they're sort of padding the truth or they're leaving out parts of the truth or being less than transparent, so on and so forth, usually it will show up. So I actually feel more optimistic about assessing this, the sincerity or trustworthiness of experts rather than their competency, although perhaps that's backwards from what others are arguing. So I wanted to, and this is really cool, Steve talked about the exact same example. My dates are different though, because I'm based in the US and not the UK. And I'm thinking about this question, what if the experts are not trustworthy? Because a lot of people in the US are saying this, thinking this, worried about it. So in March 2020, so Steve had April and July, I think. Here we were just, a little bit earlier, we were March and May. In March, the CDC and their spokespeople said, this is an actual quote, you can find it on Twitter, there's no reason to be walking around with a mask because masks do not work to protect you from the COVID-19 virus unless you are a healthcare worker. And I thought, I have another image in my head like, oh, we have smart masks now, that's awesome. When I put it on, it's gonna be like, healthcare worker, you are safe, philosophy professor, you're doomed, something like that. But of course we didn't have smart masks. I was actually teaching bioethics online at this time, March 2020. I scrapped my lesson plans for the next day and I wrote a whole lecture about how this was problematic, right? Because masks only work if you're a healthcare worker. Like, who's gonna believe that? That's a crazy thing to say, right? Then May 2020, 2 months later, the CDC said, by the way, masks do work and you had better wear one all the time in every public setting. So in between, there wasn't any new data or any new study. Steve talked about this already. But what happened here, the part that I want to focus on anyway, is something that I think is unfortunate. A large subset of the US population said, we can't trust these experts. Either masks work to protect you against COVID-19 or they don't. So either they lied the first time or they lied the second time. Who even cares? Because one of the times they did lie. They can't both work and not work. And they're obviously not smart masks. They don't know, these masks don't know if you're a healthcare worker or not. So we can't trust the CDC on masks. We can't trust the CDC on vaccines. We can't trust the CDC Maybe we can't trust scientific experts. Maybe there's no such thing as an expert. And if this sounds overblown, it's actually not. I mean, the state of things in the US is quite crazy. At least one other American is here in the audience who would attest to the fact that this is actually happening. So I think what's unfortunate here is this loss of trust. That is why I wanted to build into my definition of an expert this sincerity / trustworthiness component. Because what I want to say is a quote unquote expert who's not trustworthy is not an expert at all. So it's not like we have experts that aren't trustworthy. If they're not trustworthy, they just aren't experts. And you might be thinking, well, what sort of philosophical work is that supposed to do? Hopefully that will become clear by the end of the talk. If not, you can ask me about it. But I want to say an expert who's not trustworthy actually isn't an expert at all. Okay, so then, back to sort of what my students said a couple days ago. Well, there's just no such thing then as an expert. There's not an expert. This student didn't actually put his hands on his hips, but this kind of his face he was making was kind of like this little cartoon. There's just not an expert out there because there is no. I mean, you can't trust anyone. There's no such thing. If you build in trustworthiness into the definition of an expert, there's just not an expert. But I feel a bit more hopeful than that. Also because we'd better be able to have experts, A, and identify them, B, because we have to rely on them. No one can be an expert in every domain. Maybe you don't like the term expert, we can substitute in something else. But look, no one can know everything about neuroscience and philosophy and history and biology. It's just not possible. So we can and do rely on experts all the time in almost every domain. So what we don't want is blind trust, but we don't want to say that there is no such thing as an expert at all. So then a different student said, so give us an example then. Can you even think of an expert? And I hadn't even thought of that. Can I pick out someone historical or contemporary that sort of meets this definition? And this is perhaps not the most important part of the talk, but it did get me thinking. And the first person that came to mind was, well, what about Einstein? So he certainly knew general relativity and special relativity pretty well. He seemed to be trustworthy in his public scientific communications. His personal life was a huge mess, but that's okay. That's not in the definition of what counts as an expert. He seems to be someone who is both competent and sincere. And of course, you can think in your own mind of, perhaps a history expert, science expert, so on and so forth. So I think that they do exist. I think that there is hope that we can identify them, and there had better be, because if we can't rely on others who know more than we do in any given domain, then that's going to be problematic across the board. Okay, so we said that scientific experts or experts in general are something like epistemic authorities. So what that means is they can tell us what is the case, hopefully, given some domain or some domain specific set of questions. So they're supposed to be able to convey accurate information and, if asked or pressed, be able to explain that information. But here's what they can't do. They can't tell us what to do with that information or how to act on that information. And I don't know if you think this is obvious. I mean, I think this is obvious, but again, at home in the US where I come from, it's super not obvious. In the political sphere, even in the academic sphere, among students, colleagues, etc. They're still saying things like, follow the experts, trust the science, that kind of thing. Trust the experts, follow the science, either way. But I don't know if this will help, sort of motivate this divide between someone who can tell us what is the case and then someone who can tell us what we ought to do. But perhaps this is helpful, an analogy from clinical medicine. Imagine that you think that you might need some surgery. So you've had some sort of injury, some sports injury, I don't know what it is. And you think, what I'm going to do is find, the best surgeon out there, maybe not out there, but in my city, I'm going to find the best surgeon. So I'm going to look at competency, sincerity. I don't want someone who's drunk on the job, so to speak. You might think that's crazy, but a friend of mine sat on jury duty, and that literally was the case. The surgeon performed hundreds of surgeries when he was drunk, and the surgeries did not go well in any case. So you want to find someone who's not like that. You're going to find the best surgeon in your city. And then you're going to say, do you recommend this surgery for this injury that I have? And let's suppose that he or she says, yeah. But you want to know not just, can this person be competent and not drunk in surgery? Can they do a good job? But you also want to know, is this surgery best for you? For all the reasons that it might or might not be best for you. So again, this is not maybe a fancy example. Maybe this point is already obvious to you, but just because someone is competent and sincere in their field, it doesn't mean that they can tell you what you ought to or ought not to do. That's the idea. So this is what I call the domain issue. Moral action is outside of the domain of science. Maybe, this is not like new news, but again, it seems to have been forgotten, at least in some political and academic circles, at least in the US. Moral action just is outside of the domain of science. And we have to take information and then add to it more. What is the more? Extra scientific human values. I really like this quote. I think it sums it up well. Science cannot make value judgments. Science does not determine policy. Policy is a human endeavor that combines science with values and priorities. Maybe it's obvious, but again, in practice, it doesn't seem to be quite obvious to everyone. So of course, that means we can't just follow the science. Not a tour guide. As an aside, albeit an important one, this is not to say that science either is or should be value free. So what I said so far is something like science via the experts or the communicators can give us accurate information. Maybe that's data, numbers, whatever. And then we have to add to it more stuff. That stuff is human values. So we take this data, we put human values on it, and then maybe we're on our way towards developing the policy. But at the front end, there's also value input into science, right? So it's not like there's no values until after we had the output, then we add the values. No, I realize that there is also input into what counts as science in the first place, which research projects do we pursue, do we not pursue, all of that. And that's actually a good thing. So it's, I think, very well accepted now amongst philosophers of science. The value-free ideal is neither possible nor ideal. There are lots of non-epistemic value judgments that go into the front end of science, so to speak. And then we're going to add more values on the other end as well. So that just is to say that within the domain of science, fact and value, I don't actually like the term fact. I use it here because the literature does, but that's an aside. But fact and value are inextricably intertwined. This is okay. It's more than just okay. It's actually a really good thing. So values go into science. We do some things in the science machine, so to speak. We get out data, and then we add more to that in order to tell ourselves as communities how to act. So we can and should embrace science. We can't follow it. We have to make the hard choices ourselves. Okay, so where does this leave us so far? Science can't dictate policy, but it can inform it. It should inform it. And that's just because science can tell us what is the case. So I'm leaving aside the whole question of, with what level of certainty, so to speak, can science tell us the case? I don't think that science is an infallible method. It's a reliable one. It's super useful, very interesting, important, also fun, but it's not an infallible method. So I'm just assuming that it's giving us pretty good information, right? So it's going to tell us what is the case, not with 100% certainty, that's not possible, but roughly it's going to tell us what is the case. But in order to apply this to anything, public policy included, we have to incorporate human values. So this just means something like, look, we can trust expert testimony once we've identified someone who's competent and sincere, then we can trust that person's or that panel's testimony to be helpful in forming reliable beliefs. And then we have to add things like that in order to apply science to public policy. So I think this means at least a few things. It gives us a job for the experts, so to speak. It gives us a job for the public, so to speak. Although also I don't think there's always, perhaps maybe not even ever, a clear delineation between who is the public and who are the experts. I also don't love that terminology. Nevertheless, it's in the literature that I'm trying to engage with. So I do take it on board, at least sometimes. So the experts then, I think, I know this is controversial, must make their values available to public examination. More on that in the next slide. But then the public has to do something as well. So the experts have to say, here is the data. And if we are making a recommendation, this is the value that we're adding to the data when we're making that recommendation. Be clear about it, be honest about it, be transparent about it. Then the public has to say, okay, what do we need to supplement, or what do we need to take and sort of tack on to the science in order to apply these results to public policy? Okay, so I think experts need to make their extra scientific values explicit. Why? Certainly I'm not the first or only person to say this. This allows the values to be publicly discussed and evaluated. Is that sometimes problematic? Yes. But I really, really want to push back against views that say the public can't handle it, they're not smart enough. If you show them how the sausage is made, so to speak, then it's just going to be hell to pay. Democracy is going to fall apart at the seams or something like that. Or maybe we shouldn't even have democracy in the first place because the public isn't smart enough. So let's just go with the experts. Lots of problems with that. And I would just, as someone who's not an historian, just say, look at history. This has not worked out well for minority groups. This has not worked out well for women, and so on and so forth. We can think of a lot of historical examples where it goes very badly when some group of people is deciding what they say to the others, how they say it, whether or not they tell them the whole truth or a partial truth, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that's a good thing. I think that values need to be publicly discussed and evaluated. And I think that this can help officials make better informed decisions and help to foster public trust. Now you might say, no, it's going to go the opposite way. If we tell the public, if we tell the people the truth, then they're just not going to trust scientists. Well, first of all, they're not trusting the scientists anyway, right? So there's that. So if we're going to patch this up at all, I think the best path forward probably is going to be honesty, transparency, truth. Now, look, if it turns out that these values are made public, and the people are like, yeah, but these are not, these aren't the values that I hold. This is not the value that the communities in which I'm a part of. We don't hold these values. These are just personal biases. Maybe that's going to happen sometimes, and maybe that's okay, right? Because if we get it out on the table, so to speak, then maybe we collectively in our liberal democracy can have a discussion about it. And anyway, what we're doing right now is not working. So it might be better to try the truth. For example, I don't know if I can get back to that slide. I can't quite remember which one it was. In March 2020, and they said, there's no reason to be walking around in a mask. It's not going to work to protect you from the COVID-19 virus unless you are a healthcare worker. Surely the CDC didn't believe that. Surely what they meant was something like this: we don't have enough masks, so we should be saving them for the healthcare workers. And they thought, well, if we tell the people the truth, there's going to be a run on Walmart and CVS. These are places like people in America go to buy inexpensive masks. And then the healthcare workers aren't going to have them. Healthcare workers shouldn't have to buy them at CVS anyway, but we actually did have a mask shortage. I'm not sure if that was the case here, but it's definitely the case in the US. And so they didn't say that. They could have said something like, we don't have enough masks. Could you please, save them for the people that really need them? Could have tried it, I don't think it would have gone worse than what happened. So we have this large sort of anti-expert contingent in the US, not only because of this, but definitely in part because of this. Okay, now I have to get back to where I was. Apologies for this flipping through. Okay, right. So again, putting everything out on the table, so to speak. I know everyone doesn't agree with that, but I still stand by this, crazy idealistic view that we ought to tell people the truth. I mean, why not? It couldn't go worse, right? What does the public need to do then? Well, first of all, elect those who will, represent our values, right? And we do have this epistemic duty not to put blind trust in anyone who wears the name tag, so to speak. I'm an expert, so I want to trust them. It's clearly not what we're supposed to do, but we do need to identify those in whom our trust is warranted. Okay, so just a few, 2 slides and conclusions. Appeals to science can and should be made when making policy decisions. Again, I hope it's clear from this talk, I'm not in any way anti-science. Again, it's, I first trained as a scientist in many ways. I sometimes still think like one, or at least I'm accused of thinking like one, for better or for worse. But we have to be really careful when we're thinking about the domain issue in science, I think. So it should be recognized and publicly admitted that scientific data alone cannot dictate policy. And again, maybe you think this is obvious, but again, in many spheres in which I'm a part, it's not obvious. We need human values, and in a democratic society, those should be democratically decided ones. I realize, of course, that in a democratic society, there's going to be a plurality of values, and we might have to duke it out, so to speak. But again, I think that's better, right, than having some group saying, you must do this, do as I say. So these values must also inform our public policy related decisions. So I've been through this quickly, and I haven't given a lot of arguments, but I'll do my best to back up what I've said in the discussion in a moment. So what have I said? An expert is an individual who, well, I shouldn't have said individual actually, because it could be a panel, right? So it's an individual or a panel who's both competent and sincere. I think there is hope for being able to identify these people. Scientific experts are epistemic authorities. They can tell us what is the case. Not with 100% certainty, obviously, but with accuracy. They're not moral authorities. Perhaps a simple and boring claim, nevertheless, one that many people don't seem to understand or agree with. For the application of science to public policy, then we need to appeal to democratically decided values. And I do think that we need to be open and honest about those, whether those are coming from scientific experts, political figures, or others. Okay, thank you.